Welcome back to this edition of Like Nobody's Business. I'm Mary Beth Seawald, President and CEO of the Vegas Chamber. Last month, Governor Sisolak called a special session of the Nevada legislature to address the $1.2 billion gap in the state budget as a result of COVID-19. Today, we are pleased to present a panel conversation with three of Nevada's top government affairs experts. With us today, I'm pleased to have Billy Vasiliadis, CEO of R&R Partners, Paul Moradkin, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for the Vegas Chamber, and Brian Wachter, Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for the Retail Association of Nevada. Thank you guys all for being with us today.
Thank you.
It's been an interesting session, to say the least. I'd like to go around the room and just kind of get a sense from you guys of what you saw, what you felt, and then we'll get into some deeper questions. But Billy V, let's start with you. What were your thoughts on the special session?
Well, I think probably the most overwhelming sense I had was the slow moving and seemingly non-urgent process in the middle of a pandemic. When it's all said and done, regardless of the governors, Republican, Democrats, et cetera, usually those budgets don't vary by more than a few percentage points. And it took 2 weeks to get a few percentage points away from what was presented. Not to say the governor was right or wrong or any of that. It's just with what's happening out in the state and the fear and the concern and the business devastation that has happened, the personal devastations that have happened. I just felt as if there needed to be a greater sense of urgency to get moving, to get done. There may be more of these given what's happening. And I just think the state needed to get a greater sense of we really get it and we're really moving out of our legislature.
Okay, Brian Wachter, let's go to you next. What were your just initial overall thoughts about the special session?
Well, I would certainly agree. I think, especially given how active the Interim Finance Committee had been in the month of May and in the month of June, they had been having a lot of the conversations about, the direction, what they were expecting. And so I was very surprised that we were there for 12 days. And on days, where there just wasn't anything to do, it wasn't 12 working days. So I think that was the most shocking part. I haven't been around that long. You've got, but in terms of special sessions, they're typically a little bit more efficient. There's, usually a plan in place, and it's just more of implementing it and, having that public discussion. And it seemed in this case that plan just, simply wasn't there at the beginning.
Yeah. Okay. Paul Moradkin, what were some of your biggest takeaways?
To add to what Billy and Brian were saying, I think Billy's absolutely correct. You saw a budget presented by the governor about $1.2 billion in cuts. The legislators adjusted about $188 million. And that could have something that we would have anticipated would have been done in 4 or 5 days, not 12 days. So to the point about how long it took was surprising because you didn't even start those policy conversations that you may see later on in a special second session. This was pretty much focused on the budget, which was longer than I think any of us were anticipating.
Okay, so Paul, since we're talking to you first or next, let's give us an overview of kind of the economic impact of this special session and the impact of COVID that led to the special session.
Sure. I mean, as we all know in business, and Brian represents retail, and Billy has a huge scope of clients, we knew that COVID shutdown impact would be detriment to the state's budget. The budget they cut right now was on top of the $800 million that did last fiscal budget that ended on June 30th. So you're seeing about $2 billion impact on the state because business was closed because they had to because of the response. I think for what we saw in Carson City were tough cuts, regardless if you're a Republican or Democrat. Having to cut $1.2 billion from any state budget is hard, especially Nevada, which already has a smaller state operating budget compared to other neighboring states. But having to cut was hard for legislators. You had to pick Medicaid and education and contracts and capital improvement projects. So, I mean, to their credit, they had a lot of work to do, but the governor's office did present a pretty solid plan for them. So I think that's why we were still a little surprised it went for 12 days because they did adjust a little bit to Billy's point, but they weren't talking about the major policy topics that were not dictated by the proclamation.
Yeah, and we all know that mining was in the headlines a lot, and there was a lot of discussion around mining. Billy, talk to us about the Mining Association. What was going on with that, and how did that end up?
Well, I think that there's clearly a perception that mining has been rather held harmless during the pandemic. Perception. And when the legislature got to what Paul was just talking about, cuts of, to Medicaid or cuts to education, they were looking for some alternative revenue, which was mining. And I think the challenge with that is, there's a lot of constitutional walls around mining tax, but also to do something like that should have been discussed a month, 6 weeks leading up to the session, include the industry in the discussion, include the business community, the general business community in the discussion, Democrats and Republicans in the discussion, and have something resembling a concrete plan or direction. It seemed to be, again, a sort of, hey, maybe this will work. And so there's a bill introduced, it failed, and then the whole thing with Senator Pickard that kind of became a little bit of a sideshow, or a lot of a sideshow. And I guess my point is, again, I go back to, we're in a pandemic. As Paul said, you prepare better, or Brian both said, if you're going to take a step like that, be prepared, have the industries involved, have an understanding of what it's going to be, have the money clearly directed to some necessary funding, but it just was extraordinarily haphazard and unprogrammed. And I think that's what really challenged it. And again, the business community here for years has feared the idea of single industry taxation. If there's one thing we've all stood by, is the idea of protecting against that. Why? Because we're selfish? No, because it's never worked. Anytime we've done that, it's led to instability. You tax the gaming industry, there's a recession, there's even wildfires where there's 2 months worth of visitation decreases. Guess what? State budget takes a hit. Sales tax, we go into some sort of recession, people buy less, sales tax takes a hit. This needs to be a discussion, and I don't know that anybody even sitting here disagrees that we need a broader, or not necessarily more stable funding source for this state. That takes meaningful discussion and study, not a 2-day run in a special session.
Okay, point taken. Brian, let's talk about unemployment funding for a second. That funding is going to run out in just a matter of weeks, right? How do you see the state addressing the unemployment problem?
Well, traditionally, and I think Nevada has a good roadmap to addressing the unemployment issue. We took it earlier in the decade. We had this issue because of the Great Recession. It was important to business to make sure that unemployed workers didn't have their benefits cut. And so the business community went ahead and ate the extra cost of an additional unemployment tax in order to pay off a bond, to pay off a federal loan that we used to backfill the unemployment account last time. And so normally I would say that I think that's the direction we should go. There's a new element, though, to the unemployment issue in Nevada and the entire country, which is the amount of fraud that's being discovered. Our office manager actually yesterday got a letter saying she herself was now unemployed. And so we had to kind of deal with that and talk to Dieter. So you absolutely have, these different constraints on the current process, but I would hope, and it certainly would be the Retail Association opinion, to make sure that we go ahead and repay back whatever kind of loan we need to make sure that employees aren't seeing any benefit cuts as we go forward.
Well, and we know now that the governor is potentially going to call a second special session in the coming weeks. Paul, what do you see as being on the agenda for the second special?
Sure. When they closed the special over this past weekend, the governor did put out a press statement listing a couple potential topics. Some of them were worker protection, business protections potentially, election reform, also criminal justice, police reform. So he's given folks, I think, a good roadmap of what he's willing to consider when and if they go into another second special session. There's some other topics that are floating around, but those are some of the main interest ones I think folks are watching for right now.
Billy, do you see any other topics that might make it on the list for the second special session?
The only other thing I would see is some concerted effort to support and bolster Dieter's efforts to get unemployment payments out. To Brian's point, I think the state's always taken its obligation to make sure unemployed don't lose their benefits, et cetera. And I think that that is an issue that is plaguing us right now, and speeding up that process and getting folks taken care of. So I would hope that that is another item that's on a special session agenda.
Okay, and Brian, any other thoughts from you about the second one?
No, I just kind of hope that the legislature certainly can approach this one maybe in a little bit more of an efficient manner. The governor kind of gave them a little bit of time to go home, be more safe, but hopefully it's utilized to be able to kind of gear up for a quick second special session.
Okay, well, we got one more segment to go. Will you guys stay with us?
Absolutely.
All right, sounds good. We are here with Brian Wachter, Billy Vasiliadis, and Paul Muradkin talking about the special session of the legislature. Up next, we're going to talk about session 21 right after this.